Let's begin here, because too many confuse silence with indifference. They assume that if he doesn't speak, he doesn't feel. But the soul has its own language, one that often appears in the smallest gestures. A lingering glance, a softened tone, a pause that carries more weight than a dozen words. These are not accidents, they are symbols. Jung reminded us that the unconscious always finds a way to reveal itself, even when the conscious mind resists. So when a man seems guarded, yet his presence keeps returning, you are not imagining it. What you are seeing is love before it becomes language. And in that space lies a truth many overlook. The soul chooses long before the lips confess. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Too many of us have been trained to wait for words. We want promises, declarations, clear signs to erase doubt. Yet what if love rarely begins with certainty? What if its first arrival is quiet, unsettling, even contradictory? A man may remain silent, but his behavior bends around you. His routine shifts, his attention lingers, his energy softens when you enter the room. This is not performance. It is his unconscious speaking. Jung once said that what is not made conscious appears in life as fate. In relationships, this means feelings show themselves long before they are understood. We see it in the way someone remembers a detail you barely recall or defends you when you are not present. These patterns reveal an inner decision already forming a reorganization of the inner world. The mistake is to dismiss it, to believe silence means distance, when in fact it may mean depth. For the unconscious does not shout, it whispers, and its whispers are often truer than carefully chosen words. Here is where the shadow and persona collide. The persona wants control, predictability, safety. The shadow leaks through in sudden care, unexpected jealousy, or a restless need to be near. And in that tension lies the doorway to truth. The real task is to see with different eyes. Not eyes trained only on declarations, but eyes attuned to presence, consistency, and the quiet symbols of the soul. For when love begins to move beneath the surface, it rarely announces itself with fireworks. It begins instead like a seed hidden in the soil of ordinary days. You do not force it open. You recognize it, you tend it, and you allow it to grow in its own rhythm. This is where our reflection begins, not with the dramatic confession, but with the subtle resonance that signals something deeper is already unfolding. Because the unconscious doesn't lie. And if you pay attention, you will see that truth long before it finds words. We continue where silence has already begun to reveal its hidden language. Yet for many, the first reaction to such silence is not trust, but uncertainty. A woman notices the shift, but then doubt enters. Is she imagining it? His eyes soften. His presence leans closer, yet his words remain guarded. In this gap between what the body reveals and what the mouth withholds, a fracture begins to form. It is not an argument or a dramatic betrayal. It is the subtle ache of not knowing. This fracture touches something deeper than the present moment. It stirs memories of times when affection was uncertain, when love was conditional, when attention came and went like the tide. The unconscious stores these old wounds, and they rise again when faced with ambiguity. Silence is then confused with rejection, even when it is actually a form of depth. Here we see how the past overlays the present, how an old shadow enters the room. Jung reminded us that what we do not make conscious returns as fate. The mixed signals we see in another often reflect the tension within ourselves. We crave clarity, yet we also fear what clarity might reveal. We want assurance, but at the same time, we question whether we are worthy of receiving it. This tension plays out in the smallest details, in a delayed reply, in a distracted glance, in the tone that shifts without explanation. The persona, that outer mask we all wear, seeks to remain steady. It wants composure, predictability, the appearance of certainty. Yet beneath the surface, the shadow speaks. It reveals itself through restlessness, sudden attention, protective instincts that cannot be explained by logic. What appears inconsistent on the outside is often the mark of an inner conflict unfolding on the inside. And for the one receiving these signs, the fracture can feel destabilizing. She wonders, is this genuine care or only her imagination? She feels the warmth of presence one moment and the chill of distance the next. This back and forth unsettles her, not because she lacks strength, but because her deeper longing is for resonance, not performance. She wants to know if the soul beneath the mask has truly recognized her. This is the beginning of the psychological journey. The fracture forces awareness. It calls us to look beyond appearances and notice how much we project our own fears into another's silence. It reminds us that the ache of not knowing is not only about the other person, it is about the unresolved voices within ourselves that demand certainty at all costs. In this way, what seems like a small relational confusion becomes a mirror of the individuation process. We are asked to see how much we depend on external reassurance, how quickly we abandon our own perception, how easily we hand authority for our feelings to another. The fracture hurts, but it also teaches. It reveals the gap between what the soul senses and what the mind demands. Too often, we look for answers in the persona, in the polished surface of words and promises. Yet the deeper truth is already alive in the shadow, in the gestures that escape control, in the quiet shifts of presence that speak louder than declarations. Jung showed us that symbols are the language of the unconscious. In this fracture, the symbols are everywhere. The way his energy sharpens when her name is spoken, the way he remembers what she thought. He forgot the way silence beside her feels full instead of empty. Still, the ache of not knowing lingers. And that is part of the journey. Every relationship that touches the soul awakens the fear of projection, the worry that what we see is only our wish, not reality. This is why the first fracture is so powerful. It shows us how quickly the unconscious pulls old shadows into the present, how swiftly uncertainty awakens ancient doubts. Yet this moment is not an ending. It is a threshold. To remain here is to suffer the cycle of confusion. To pass through it is to learn the art of seeing differently. not through fear, but through symbols, patterns, and presence. It is here that individuation begins to stir. We are asked to hold the tension, to live with ambiguity long enough for truth to reveal itself. When a woman can stand in this fracture without rushing to demand answers, she begins to reclaim her authority. She does not silence her intuition, nor does she surrender it to every flicker of another's persona. Instead, she listens more deeply both to herself and to the quiet gestures unfolding before her. This patience is not passivity, it is strength. The strength to wait for the unconscious to rise into awareness. The first fracture is uncomfortable because it dismantles illusions. It strips away the fantasy of perfect clarity, the dream of immediate certainty. But in this stripping away lies the seed of real connection. For only by facing the ache of not knowing can we begin to distinguish between projection and presence, between old shadows and living truth. This is the task that stands before us now, to see ambiguity not as a failure of love, but as the first invitation into its deeper reality. To recognize that the soul rarely announces itself with clarity in the beginning. It arrives in fragments and contradictions, in half-formed signs that challenge the persona and awaken the shadow. The fracture teaches us this, that love, like individuation, does not begin with certainty. It begins with disruption, with the recognition that something is stirring beneath the surface, something neither fully understood nor easily dismissed. It asks us to remain steady, to observe, to listen not only to the other, but to ourselves. And as we hold this tension, as we refuse to collapse into fear or to force answers before their time, we discover a new capacity within. The capacity to stand in ambiguity without losing our center. The ability to see with eyes that are not blinded by projection. The willingness to trust that the unconscious, though silent, does not lie. This is where part 2 leaves us at the threshold of awareness, standing in the first crack where old wounds and present signs meet. The fracture unsettles, but it also invites. It is the opening through which individuation begins its work, preparing us for the deeper unfolding yet to come. The first fracture unsettles us because it exposes a hidden truth we live between two worlds. One is the persona, the mask we polish for others steady and composed. The other is the shadow filled with impulses, fears, and unspoken desires. In love, these two worlds collide more often than we admit. What looks like inconsistency is often the persona resisting while the shadow presses forward. Consider how often someone presents themselves as calm, rational, even indifferent, yet their behavior betrays them. Their eyes follow you when they claim not to notice. Their voice changes in tone when they speak only to you. These moments are not accidents. They are cracks in the mask. The persona struggles to remain in control, but the shadow slips through, revealing what the conscious mind has not yet admitted. This struggle is not only his, it is also hers and ours. We all know what it means to wear a mask. We smile when we feel sorrow. We speak with confidence while hiding uncertainty. We pretend indifference when something matters deeply. The persona is useful. It allows us to move through society, to function in roles to be recognized. Yet, it is never the whole story. Beneath it, the shadow waits carrying both what we fear and what we desire most. In relationships, the cost of clinging to persona becomes heavy. When someone hides behind a polished mask for too long, they begin to lose vitality. They may seem present, but their energy feels distant, hollow, restrained. And for the one seeking connection, this distance awakens doubt. She begins to feel as though she must earn attention, as though she must prove her worth against the silence. This is the pain of living with a mask. It invites performance rather than presence. Jung taught that the shadow is not only darkness, it also holds the vitality, the spontaneity, the instinct to protect what we love. When a man defends you in your absence, when his attention lingers on the smallest details, it is the shadow speaking through him. He may not plan it, he may not even want it, but the unconscious insists. His soul reveals what his persona is not yet ready to confess. Yet the shadow is rarely clean. Along with tenderness comes fear, hesitation, even jealousy. He may step forward one moment and withdraw the next. He may protect you fiercely, yet resist intimacy when it draws too near. This back and forth is not cruelty. It is the collision of two forces. The persona wants safety. The shadow wants truth. Together, they create the strange rhythm we call mixed signals. For her, the challenge is profound. She feels the warmth of the shadow, but she also confronts the cold surface of the persona. One moment feels like deep recognition, the next like rejection. She begins to question her perception, to wonder if she is inventing what she sees. Here the shadow within herself is stirred. Old memories of being overlooked or dismissed rise again, demanding attention. This is why Jung insisted that relationships serve as mirrors. The other person's mask and shadow awaken our own. When he withholds, her old wounds ache. When he reveals glimpses of tenderness, her longing deepens. This cycle is not random. It is the psyche calling her toward greater consciousness, toward the work of individuation. She must decide whether she will collapse into doubt or learn to stand steady in the presence of contradiction. Masks are seductive. They give the illusion of control. They make us feel we know who the other person is, and they help us believe we are presenting ourselves acceptably to the world. But masks also suffocate. They prevent us from offering the gift of authenticity, and they keep us from receiving it from others. The shadow may be frightening, but it is alive. The persona may appear safe, but it is lifeless if worn too tightly. To see this clearly is already a step toward awakening. It is the recognition that love cannot be built only on the persona. If all we share is a mask, then the connection will always feel brittle, easily broken by silence or misunderstanding. But when the shadow is acknowledged, when the tenderness, the jealousy, the fear, and the longing are brought into awareness, then something true begins to emerge. This does not happen all at once. The unconscious moves slowly, and so does the process of individuation. At first, we only see fragments. A soft gaze here, an unexpected act of care there. These fragments are the shadow reaching out, asking to be recognized. They disturb the persona, but they also reveal the deeper truth that the soul has already made a choice, even if the mind has not caught up. For the woman watching this unfold, the temptation is to force clarity to demand the mask be removed at once. Yet this rarely works. The persona is not easily dismantled, and the shadow cannot be forced into the light without care. What is required is patience, the ability to see both mask and shadow, to acknowledge both without collapsing into fear. This is the heart of part 3. The shadow and the persona stand opposed, yet both are essential. Without the persona, we cannot live in the world. Without the shadow, we cannot live in truth. When love stirs beneath the surface, it calls these two forces into conflict. The result is confusion, but also possibility. The lesson here is to witness the mask without being deceived by it, and to notice the shadow without being overwhelmed by it, to see how both play their part in the unfolding drama of the soul. The tension is not a sign of failure, but a sign of depth. For only where there is conflict can transformation begin, and so the story moves forward. What feels like contradiction is actually preparation. The persona cracks, the shadow emerges, and the unconscious begins to reveal its direction. We stand here in the middle of the struggle, waiting for the first light of awakening to break through the tension. The struggle between persona and shadow always leaves a residue of confusion. Masks appear convincing, but they cannot hold forever. Shadows press forward, but they unsettle as much as they reveal. And in this tension, something new begins to stir. The awakening does not arrive like a sudden revelation. It comes quietly, like light seeping through a closed curtain. She begins to notice that the contradiction itself carries meaning. What once seemed like inconsistency now feels like a hidden message. Silence no longer appears as distance, but as presence unshaped by words. Glances once doubted now reveal a resonance too steady to dismiss. It is here that the unconscious speaks most clearly, not through promises, but through patterns. Jung observed that the soul communicates in symbols, not explanations. This is why the unconscious does not announce its decisions with clarity at first. Instead, it reveals itself through subtle signs, gestures, and rhythms. A man may still speak cautiously, but his body leans forward. He may withhold declarations, but his behavior reorganizes itself around another. These are not contradictions. They are symbols pointing to what the conscious mind has not yet admitted. Awakening begins when we shift how we see. Instead of demanding certainty, we allow ourselves to observe with patience. Instead of treating silence as rejection, we treat it as depth. This is not naive optimism. It is a new lens, one that trusts the unconscious to reveal truth in its own rhythm. The awakening is less about him than about her capacity to perceive differently. When she no longer interprets every gap as abandonment, she begins to stand on solid ground. This steadiness is the first sign of individuation. The psyche no longer bends entirely to the fear of being overlooked. Instead, it listens with broader awareness. She notices not only the persona, not only the shadow, but the dance between them. In this dance, something essential is revealed. The unconscious already knows what the conscious mind resists. Awakening also means recognizing projection. How often do we confuse our old wounds with present reality? The ache of not knowing can awaken memories of rejection. Yet those memories belong to the past. By separating projection from perception, we begin to see more clearly. This clarity is a step out of illusion and into presence. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, staying awake within ambiguity, long enough for truth to surface. This kind of awakening requires courage, but not the kind that shouts or demands. It is the courage of patience, the willingness to see beyond masks without tearing them away, the steadiness to feel the pull of the shadow without collapsing into fear, and above all, the capacity to trust what symbols reveal even before words appear. Think of how a seed germinates. At first, nothing seems to change. The soil looks the same, the surface untouched. Yet beneath something essential is breaking open, reorganizing itself toward light. This is the image of awakening in love. What looks inconsistent on the surface is actually a sign that the inner world is reshaping itself. The old defenses crack, making space for a new reality. Awakening also carries an invitation. It invites her to shift from passivity to presence. Rather than waiting endlessly for declarations, she pays attention to transformation in gestures, in patterns, in the quiet way. Energy bends toward her. She no longer demands an answer on her timeline because she begins to understand the deeper rhythm of the soul. This recognition is not weakness, it is wisdom. Jung often spoke of the anima, and animus, the inner feminine and masculine energies that shape our relationships. In awakening, she recognizes that what resonates in him is not only about her presence, but also about his own anima being stirred. Likewise, she senses her animus being challenged, not to dominate, but to guide her toward greater balance. These archetypal movements remind us that love is never only personal, it is also symbolic. It carries the weight of the psyche's need for wholeness. At this stage, her task is simple, though not easy. She must remain open, without clinging, receptive, without losing her center. She must allow herself to witness the unfolding of the unconscious in another, while also attending to the movements of her own. This balance is the heart of individuation, to honor both connection and self, both resonance and boundary. Awakening shifts the story from doubt to discovery. Instead of being trapped in the ache of not knowing, she begins to sense a deeper order behind the contradictions. Instead of reacting to silence with fear, she receives it as a different form of presence. And instead of being caught in the drama of masks and shadows, she sees the possibility of integration. This is not the final step. It is only the beginning of a clearer path. But once the soul has glimpsed the symbols of its own truth, it cannot return to blindness. Awakening changes how we listen, how we trust, how we wait. It creates a steadier foundation, preparing us for the choices and boundaries that will soon be required. The awakening is above all an inner reframe. It is the recognition that love is not always spoken in words, but in the way a life begins to shift around another. It is the understanding that silence, far from being indifference, may be the soul's first language, and it is the quiet courage to see symbols for what they are, guides pointing toward a deeper truth waiting to be lived. And so the tension of mask and shadow does not end here, but it begins to make sense. We no longer see contradiction as chaos, but as the preparation for transformation. The awakening is the first light breaking through, gentle, steady, undeniable. Awakening shows us that silence and contradiction may carry meaning, but awareness alone is never the end. Awareness must be followed by choice. Without choice, we remain trapped in endless interpretation, always waiting for the other to act first. The soul matures when it learns to place boundaries where there was once only longing. Many mistake boundaries for ultimatums, but a boundary is not a demand. A demand says, "You must change for me to feel secure." A boundary says, "This is the ground on which I will stand whether you join me or not." One arises from fear, the other from clarity. And it is in clarity that transformation occurs. At this stage, she realizes she cannot control another's mask or shadow. She cannot dictate the pace of his recognition or force declarations before their time. What she can control is how she responds, how she values her presence, how she refuses to abandon herself in the name of waiting. This is the turning point where individuation deepens, when she learns that self-respect is the most powerful mirror she can hold before another. Jung taught that individuation is the process of becoming whole, not perfect. Wholeness comes when the opposites inside us are integrated. In love, this means balancing the receptive feminine with the active principle of choice. To awaken without choosing is to remain vulnerable to cycles of confusion. To choose without awareness is to fall into rigidity. But when awareness and choice unite, something remarkable occurs. The relationship begins to reorganize itself around truth. This is the moment where silence no longer dictates her worth. She answers ambiguity, not with panic, but with steady action. Instead of chasing, she invests in her own rhythm of life. Instead, decoding every glance, she sets standards for how she wishes to be treated, not harshly, not with pride, but with quiet certainty. Standards do not need loud defense. They carry their own gravity. In practice, this might mean she no longer accepts last-minute scraps of attention. It might mean she slows her response to match the depth of what she receives. It might mean she steps back from the cycle of hot and cold, choosing instead the steady warmth of her own center. These are not punishments. They are mirrors. They reveal whether the connection can withstand truth or whether it collapses without illusion, and often the soul responds. When a woman stands in her worth, masks fall faster. The persona cannot maintain control when it meets the steady presence of someone who will not be deceived by it. The shadow too softens when it senses that honesty is welcomed, not judged. What seemed like contradiction begins to settle into clarity, not because she demanded it, but because her choice created the conditions for truth to surface. Here the archetype of the sovereign emerges. This is the image of inner authority, the man or woman who no longer seeks validation outside, but governs their own being with dignity. In love, the sovereign does not dominate the other. They hold steady ground and invite the other to meet them there. If the invitation is accepted, the bond deepens. If it is refused, the sovereign remains whole. This shift also transforms how she interprets care. Once she may have mistaken small gestures for proof of devotion. Now she sees the difference between fleeting impulse and consistent presence. She learns to measure love not by occasional signs, but by the overall pattern of respect, protection, and alignment. Her boundary refines her vision. It filters noise from signal. This act of choosing also softens fear. No longer does she wait in uncertainty, wondering whether silence means rejection. She already knows her worth, regardless of the outcome. This freedom allows her to meet him, not as a beggar for reassurance, but as an equal in the unfolding of truth. And in that equality, real intimacy becomes possible. Jung reminded us that the unconscious seeks balance. What is denied will eventually surface. By setting boundaries, she accelerates this process. The man who truly resonates cannot ignore the call of the unconscious forever. Her clarity becomes a catalyst, forcing the persona to either collapse or integrate. Either way, the truth rises more quickly than it would through endless waiting. This is transformation in its most grounded form. It is not about forcing the other to confess love. It is about anchoring in self-respect so that the relationship evolves naturally, free from illusions. If the connection is real, it will align with her standards. If it is not, her boundary will release her before more energy is wasted. Both outcomes are forms of protection. Both outcomes are progress. We must also see that boundaries are not walls. A wall shuts out life. A boundary allows life in, but only in ways that nourish rather than deplete. This distinction is essential. Many confuse self-protection with isolation, but individuation seeks balance. She remains open receptive, but not at the cost of her dignity. In this balance, she embodies both strength and softness. The transformation here is subtle yet immense. It is the shift from waiting to choosing, from demanding to standing, from fear to clarity. Once this shift occurs, the relationship can no longer remain in the same cycle. It must evolve or dissolve, and either way, she remains whole. Part 5, then, is not about grand gestures. It is about the quiet but powerful decision to live by standards rather than demands, to honor self-respect over insecurity, and to trust that clarity is more attractive than confusion. This choice does not guarantee the outcome of love, but it guarantees the integrity of the soul. And with that integrity, she steps into a new field of possibility. The old patterns lose their grip. The shadows no longer dictate from the dark. The persona no longer deceives with polished masks. She stands steady, and the unconscious aligns itself to meet her. In this act, transformation has already begun. Every journey of the heart begins in uncertainty, yet it cannot end there. The tension between silence and presence, between persona and shadow, leads us toward something larger than desire. It leads us toward integration. What began as confusion has become transformation. What once felt like mixed signals now reveals itself as the slow unfolding of truth. The final task is not to prove love or to secure promises. The final task is to stand in wholeness, whether love is spoken aloud or remains unspoken. For real love, like individuation, cannot be forced. It grows in its own rhythm, shaped by the deeper movement of the soul. We have seen how awareness begins with noticing subtle signs, how fracture awakens old wounds, how persona and shadow collide, how awakening reframes silence presence, and how choice transforms longing into clarity. Now, at the close of this reflection, we see the lesson in full. Love is not made real by demands or declarations. It is made real by presence, by the quiet reorganization of life around another soul, by the willingness to be vulnerable without armor. And yet, the deeper work is not only about whether he has chosen her. The deeper work is whether she has chosen herself. Jung taught that individuation is not about becoming perfect, but about becoming whole. This means honoring both our strength and our tenderness, both our longing and our independence. A woman who stands in her worth no longer waits passively for recognition. She offers her presence freely, but she also protects her essence with boundaries. She is not diminished by uncertainty because she has learned to trust the silent guidance of her own soul. This is the paradox of love and wholeness. Only when we no longer need another to complete us can we meet them as equals. Only when we have faced our own shadow can we embrace theirs without fear. And only when we have allowed the persona to soften can we see the other, not as a mask, but as a mirror. The closure, then, is not the end of longing. It is the beginning of peace. Peace in knowing that love reveals itself through actions more than words. Peace in knowing that silence can hold truth as surely as declarations. Peace in knowing that when the soul has chosen time itself, will carry the recognition into being. But the greatest peace comes from within. To realize that you are already whole, already enough, already worthy, whether or not another finds the courage to name what they feel. When you rest in that truth, you no longer chase. You no longer beg. You no longer measure your value against someone else's hesitation. Instead, you live from the quiet certainty that real love begins first with the love you hold for yourself. Jung often spoke of the symbol of home, not the house of walls and doors, but the inner home where the self resides. To discover this inner home is to end the restless search for external approval. It is to know that love, when it arrives, is not meant to complete you, but to accompany you. And when you have found this home within, you will recognize another soul who is ready to walk beside you, not out of need, but out of choice. So, the lesson is simple, yet profound. Look beyond words. Honor the signs that the unconscious reveals. Trust your intuition, but also set standards that protect your dignity. Welcome the shadow when it appears, but do not confuse it with the whole. Above all, remain steady in yourself, for love is not the surrender of self, but the meeting of two whole beings who see each other clearly. And if you carry one image with you, let it be, this love is less like fire and more like a lamp. Fire burns brightly and fades quickly. A lamp glows steadily, quietly illuminating without demand. When love is real, it takes the shape of that lamp. It is steady, it is warm, it is constant, and it becomes in time a home for the soul. Before we close, take a moment to reflect. Which part of this journey spoke most to you? The fracture of doubt, the struggle of the mask, the awakening of new sight, or the choice that brought peace? Share your reflections in the comments, not just for me, but for yourself. For when you name what resonates, you give voice to your own soul. And remember, this timeless truth. What is real does not need to shout. It remains. It grows quietly, like roots deepening in the earth, like light returning with each dawn. Love is not a performance. It is presence, and the deepest presence you can ever offer is the wholeness of your own being.